The clatter of the overflowing dumpster lid echoed in the pre-dawn quiet, a jarring punctuation mark in the symphony of urban decay. James shivered, pulling his threadbare jacket tighter against the biting wind that whipped through the alleyway in Rhode Island. He hated this part of the job. The smell, the filth, the sheer desperation clinging to the discarded remnants of other people's lives. It was a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. James sighed, the condensation clouding in front of his face before dissipating into the cold air. He checked his watch, a cheap digital model he'd picked up at a flea market. 5:57 a.m. 3 more minutes until his shift at the warehouse began. He needed to hurry. He'd been working at Harding Industries for almost a year now, a nameless cog in their vast logistical machine. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, each one a monotonous cycle of loading, unloading, and the constant, nagging worry of whether he'd be able to make rent. It wasn't exactly the life he'd envisioned for himself, but it was a living, however meager. James straightened his posture as he walked through the back entrance of the Harding Industries warehouse. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glow on the cavernous space. Forklifts beeped incessantly, their drivers weaving expertly through the stacks of boxes. The air was thick with the scent of cardboard and industrial. "Cleaner. Late again, Davis?" growled a voice behind him. James turned to see Marcus, his supervisor, a hulking man with a permanent scowl etched onto his face. "Sorry, Marcus," James mumbled, avoiding eye contact. The bus was delayed. Marcus snorted. Excuses, just get to work. We've got a big shipment coming in from Pennsylvania this morning." He pointed a thick finger towards a row of waiting pallets. "Those boxes need to be unloaded and sorted. Chop, chop." James nodded and hurried to his assigned station, grabbing a pair of worn-out work gloves from a nearby shelf. He slipped them on, the familiar texture a small comfort in the face of the day's drudgery. He started unloading the first pallet, the repetitive motion a welcome distraction from his thoughts. He thought about Sarah, his younger sister. She was still in college, and he was doing everything he could to help her out. Every penny he earned, after rent and basic necessities, went straight to her tuition. He wanted her to have a better life, a life free from the kind of struggle he was enduring. "Hey, Davis!" called a voice from across the aisle. James looked up to see Emily, one of the other warehouse workers, approaching him. Emily was a bright spot in the otherwise dreary environment. She always had a smile on her face and a kind word for everyone. "What's up, Em?" James asked, returning her smile. "Just wanted to let you know there's free coffee in the break room," she said. "Figured you could use a pick-me-up after that run-in with Marcus." James chuckled. "Thanks. I appreciate it. Maybe I'll sneak away for a cup later." Emily grinned. "Sounds like a plan. See you around." James watched as Emily walked away, her cheerful presence briefly lifting his spirits. He returned to his work, the weight of the boxes feeling a little less heavy. Later, during his lunch break, James sat alone in the break room, sipping his lukewarm coffee and scrolling through his phone. He was checking on Sarah's social media. He loved seeing pictures of her laughing with her friends. He sent her a quick text message, telling her he was thinking of her. The break room was sparsely furnished, with a few plastic tables and chairs and a vending machine that dispensed stale snacks. The air was thick with the aroma of instant coffee and microwaved meals. He often overheard snippets of conversations from the other workers, complaints about management, gossip about co-workers, dreams of a better future. "Rough day, Davis?" a voice asked. James looked up to see a man he didn't recognize standing in the doorway. The man was dressed in the same security guard uniform as the others, but something about him seemed different. He had kind eyes and a gentle smile, and he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. "Yeah, pretty much the same as always," James replied, taking another sip of his coffee. "Just trying to make it through the day." The man nodded, understandingly. "I know the feeling. This job can be tough." He paused. "Name's Arthur, by the way. Just started this week." "James," he replied, shaking Arthur's hand. Arthur's grip was surprisingly firm. "Welcome to the Harding Industries sweatshop," Arthur chuckled. "Glad to be here, helping out." They talked for a few minutes, about the weather, about the upcoming football season, about the general monotony of their lives. Arthur seemed genuinely interested in what James had to say, and James found himself feeling more relaxed than he had in a long time. The lunch break ended too soon, and James had to return to his work. He found himself thinking about Arthur throughout the afternoon. There was something about him that he couldn't quite put his finger on. As the day drew to a close, James was exhausted, his muscles aching, his mind numb. He punched out and headed towards the back entrance, eager to get home and collapse into bed. He saw Arthur standing near the entrance, talking to Marcus. Marcus was gesturing animatedly, his face red with anger. James couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clear that they were having a heated argument. As James approached, Marcus turned to him, his eyes blazing. "Davis!" he barked. "Get over here!" James hesitated, but obeyed. He walked over to where Marcus and Arthur were standing, a knot of apprehension forming in his stomach. "This security guard," Marcus spat out, gesturing towards Arthur with disdain, "claims he saw you stealing from the warehouse today. Says he saw you slipping something into your bag." James stared at Marcus, dumbfounded. "What? That's not true. I didn't steal anything!" Marcus glared at him. "Don't lie to me, Davis. I know you're struggling. I've seen the way you look at those boxes. And now, this guard is saying he has proof." James turned to Arthur, his eyes pleading. "Arthur, you know, I didn't do anything. Tell him you're mistaken." Arthur looked at James, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Marcus interrupted him. "I don't need to hear any more excuses," Marcus said. "Davis, you're fired. Get out of here. And if I ever see you near this warehouse again, I'll call the police." James stood there, stunned, the weight of Marcus's words crushing him. He was fired. Just like that. His livelihood, his ability to support Sarah gone in an instant. But Sarah?" he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "I don't care about Sarah," Marcus snapped. "Get out!" Tears welled up in James's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He wouldn't give Marcus the satisfaction. He turned and walked away, his head held high, his heart breaking. He walked out of the warehouse and into the cool evening air, his future suddenly uncertain. He didn't know what he was going to do, how he was going to survive. But one thing was certain. His life had just taken a dramatic, unexpected turn. As he walked away from Harding Industries, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Arthur, hurrying towards him. "James, wait!" Arthur called out. James stopped and waited for Arthur to catch up. He looked at Arthur, his eyes filled with confusion and betrayal. "Why, Arthur?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that? Why did you lie about me?" Arthur looked at James, his expression filled with sorrow. "James," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I need to tell you something. Something you won't believe." He paused, took a deep breath, and looked directly into James's eyes. "My name isn't Arthur," he said. "My name is Arthur Harding, and I'm your father." James stared at Arthur, his mind reeling. His father? The owner of Harding Industries? The man who had just fired him? It was impossible. It couldn't be true. "No," James said, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's not true. My father, he died years ago." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to James. James looked at the photograph, his heart pounding, in his chest. It was a picture of his mother, younger and happier, standing next to a man he had never seen before. But there was something familiar about the man's eyes, something that reminded him of Arthur. "Your mother never told you about me," Arthur said, his voice filled with regret. "We were young. We made mistakes. I left, and I never looked back. Until now." James looked from the photograph to Arthur, his mind struggling to process the information. His father was alive,